Right. Hello, everybody. Can people hear me? The microphone does seem to be working. So I'm Andrew Jamieson.
Oliver Manahan.
Oliver Manahan. Excellent. Did you see as we walked up on stage, we did a bit of a tap and go as we came on the stage there? A little bit of contactless humor for everybody. I thought it was funny. So who here knows PCI? I know I did this bit a little bit, the other day. PCI, there's no one with their hands up. Once again, you're in the wrong conference. But who here knows what EMVCo does, more importantly? More people in PCI, absolutely in the wrong conference.
Okay, I'm done.
Excellent, excellent. So what does EMVCo do?
Well, thanks for sending that over. And maybe it's worthy of a quick introduction for myself, because I had a predecessor, Brian Byrne, who was at least a decade with EMVCo, did many great things, and I have clearly big shoes to fill. I actually started my payments journey after a short and sweet career, short and sweet, maybe 8 years doing IT. I was a programmer in COBOL and languages that don't exist anymore. So 1996 came along, Visa was doing some stuff with smart cards, so I went to Visa Canada. I'm Canadian, if you haven't figured out from my voice yet. 1996 to 2006, started working on chip projects. And so we were actually doing chip projects then and started getting into contactless. And then 2006, I moved over to MasterCard, and for the next 10 years, did chip and contactless implementations. For the first couple of years, just finishing up the Canadian migration, thought I was going to go off and do something else, and then an announcement came out about a liability shift in the US. The next thing I knew, I was on a plane for 6 straight years, doing nothing but managing chip implementations in the US. After that was done, I went to a semiconductor company. So if you've got a payment card in your pocket and it's got a chip in it, the former company that I worked for, Infineon Technologies, there's a reasonable chance that it's one of their chips in there. If anybody follows the press, there was a shortage of chips over the past couple of years. It made for a less than fun couple of years trying to do business development in an area where you didn't have the product to deliver. So the opportunity to become Director of Engagement and Operations at EMVCo came along, and I was fortunate enough to land that role. So here I am, and yeah, I will try to quickly go through what it is we do. And the specifications is probably one thing that most people know the best about us. If you go back in time, there's ISO specifications, ISO 7816. They're fairly broad in terms of what you could do. You can put 20 volts onto a chip card. And so terminal manufacturers would say, that's great, we've got lots of voltage here, let's put 20 volts onto a chip card. Chip cards could only accept 3 to 5 volts, and in early days, things would literally burn in the terminal. So
fun to do, though.
Yeah, it is fun. You get a science lab, Bunsen burners and stuff, and you burn stuff. Who doesn't love that? However, the global payments bodies got together and said, we actually need to take those ISO specifications and make them more specific for payments. So not only have we done now chip contactless, I'll miss some QR codes, 3D secure remote commerce. I apologize for the ones I missed, QR codes, etc. It's great to have specifications. I could, if anybody's going to the reception after, I could tell stories about how specifications are interpreted differently sometimes than how they're written. So therefore, you actually need an approval and evaluation process. So we've done that. We accredit labs and things like that. Another key thing we work on is EMVCo marks. And I think the most common one that people are used to seeing is you have a card and it's got those radial marks on it that indicate to you that you actually have contactless capability on that card. And if you see a merchant device that has the acceptance contactless marks on it, then to a consumer, that means, hey, I can tap my card. Figuring out where to tap it, how close to tap it, things like that we'll get into later in this presentation. But what we sometimes also have happen is some geographies around the world will use marks similar to ours for perhaps transit or some other type of NFC usage that then confuses the consumer. And so we have to act sort of in policing of those marks to make sure that we've got them trademarked. There's usage guidelines and things like that. If you go on the EMVCo website, you can find them. It's great reading. I suggest it if you're having trouble sleeping or anything like that. And the fourth pillar there, the most fun one, is the industry engagement and collaboration. So I get to come up on stage with august people like Andrew here, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in the next slide, but it's all about talking to the industry as a whole and understanding what your needs and requirements are, seeing what we can do with respect to working in as much collaboration as we possibly can. So here are the groups that we deal with on a somewhat regular basis. Of course, PCI SSC being one of the top ones. NFC Forum I'll talk a little bit more about as it relates to read range and things like that. What's important, we can't always, because NFC has a multitude of use cases. Our use case is payment. What we try to do is stay as aligned as possible. What we never want to do is come out of alignment so that NFC is going in one direction, we're going another direction, and we just confuse the industry out there that's trying to produce product solutions, things like that. So this is why we have all of these industry engagement groups and why we stay as aligned as possible with them.
Excellent. So what I took from all of that is you worked on COBOL and COBOL's gone away. You worked on chips, there's a chip shortage. And just like on this stage, do I need to be worried?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I think the Stripe guys were just saying, that if you bifurcate those two fields, then there's no need for what it is you do. Was that kind of what I took from that?
Fair enough. Let's go off and go to the pub. Okay. So I think what we want to try and highlight here is the fact that these two organizations, EMVCo and PCI SSC, we work together to help secure payments, but from different angles. So from a PCI SSC point of view, we do the environmental and operational security, how the payment data is secured, how the pins are secured, how the PANs are secured, how the payment processing is secured in the backends and so forth. And from an EMVCo point of view?
Functional interoperability and security. So, does it work when you tap the card onto the terminal or onto the mobile device and things like that? That is a priceless image, by the way.
Thank you for that. So we all have standards. Both of these organizations have standards, and standards work together, but are separate. To talk about the environmental security and the operational impacts and so forth. So from PCI point of view, so we have standards on POI, payment processing environments. We have standards on the security of PIN entry and encryption, and we'll talk a little bit about PIN entry and what we call cardholder verification methods in a minute. We look at the security of account data during and after processing, how that works, and the associated terminal management, the associated key management that goes on to help make sure that when we're securing that data, we're generally going to be doing that with cryptography, and that cryptography needs key management on the terminal side, at the front end, in the back ends, and so forth. And so once again, for EMVCo,
yeah, physical properties and security of payment instruments, how the card and the terminal communicate. And so, if it's contact, you insert your card, there's, one way it communicates and can be, somewhat more data that flows back and forth. In a contactless transaction, it's got to be quick, where the information's read from the chip and then it gets passed on, but the card or device can be removed from the field. And so there's different ways of, how the terminal and card communicate depending on the protocol, things like that. Certainly the security, the payment card and chip, and interesting things, at least interesting to me, because I came from the semiconductor field most recently. Things like you don't want to be able to easily pop a chip out of a card without having that chip sort of destroy itself, blow its fuse, for lack of a better descriptor, because fraudsters, criminals out there will in fact try to pop a chip out of one card and insert it into another card, and then they put the their correct primary account number and expiration date and things written onto the card or embossed onto the card and go off and perpetrate fraud. And finally, security of authentication on payment instruments. So CD/CVM, whether PIN, biometrics, things like that.
So CD/CVM, what does that stand for?
Beats me. Consumer device cardholder verification method. Does that sound right?
That was good. That's not in the notes. I was just checking to make sure you knew.
It's actually gone, like any good acronym, I think it's gone through at least 2 or 3 iterations.
It actually has.
Kind of like COTS is commercial or consumer.
We'll be talking about the definition of COTS later on. We'll get to that. All
right.
So I did promise we'll get to cardholder authentication. So when you're authenticating yourself as part of a transaction, you can do this a number of ways. Obviously, there's signature. I'm not going to be talking about signature, but there's other ways as well. And in some of those ways, you use a PIN. Now, the way that PIN is processed and used depends a little bit on the type of transaction. It depends a little bit on how the terminal talks to the card, and the way the terminal talks to the card, that's defined within EMVCo specs. So there is this thing called offline PIN. And in an offline PIN processing transaction, then the customer enters a PIN, and that PIN is then sent to the payment card for validation. And that occurs based on EMVCo specifications in terms of how that's done, whether the pin's in plain text or encrypted and so forth. But that is defined, and that can only happen in a contact chip processing environment. You don't have offline PIN with contactless because the PIN can't be sent to the contactless card in a secure way. At the moment, specifications change over time. Online PIN, that's where the cardholder enters their PIN and the PIN is sent through to the issuer, generally through the acquirer. It goes through certain PIN translation steps where it's encrypted under one key, decrypted, and then re-encrypted under another key for the different hops, but it doesn't go to the card. And that's kind of important because that is then processed in a way that's not necessarily defined by EMVCo because it's in an online world. It doesn't occur sent to the chip. We've also got what we mentioned in terms of CD CVM. So CVM being cardholder verification method, CD being consumer device. So something where you are authenticating yourself directly to something that is a payment instrument. And we use the term payment instrument because we're kind of moving away from cards. So, sure, it's a card and you can put your card on your phone, but at this point, it's not a card anymore. It's a payment instrument. You're using it as an instrument to make a payment. You can authenticate yourself to that terminal, to that card, sorry, the payment instrument, using a PIN. Maybe you enter it in. It's a different term of PIN. This is not your offline PIN or online PIN at this point. This is kind of your phone PIN. And this is one of the points I want to get across. We do overload a lot of terms in payments. And it's important to understand when you use terms like PINs, exactly which PIN you're talking about. When you're talking about CD-CVM, it's not necessarily a payment card PIN, it's a PIN for the payment instrument. You've also got biometrics, of course, that can be used in that context as well. And we'll talk about MPOC a little bit later on, but MPOC supports all of these different types of authentication. Now within EMVCo, there are standards, I believe, the SBMP, the software-based mobile payments, that talk about how CD-CVM processes can be secured and implemented.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next slide, I think, is yours.
Yeah. So can you still unlock your phone with your face after all that anti-glare makeup you got last
I really can't.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Me neither.
Nothing.
Mine's not working anymore.
I'm completely, people in the audience who know me, they're looking up, they don't know who I am
Who is
anymore.
that? Yeah.
Yeah.
We could literally change places. They wouldn't know.
Just like that.
Yes. Actually, the previous speakers, I think it was Rashawn and Sean, went into some of this, so I won't belabor the point, but I think the first quote-unquote mobile payments were trialed by Coca-Cola back in 1997 with an SMS. I remember, I think this was in my Visa days, it had to be like 2004 or something like that, having a Nokia flip phone that they had built a few special models with contactless. And up in Canada, we've got this major coffee and donut chain called Tim Hortons, and they had implemented contactless acceptance. And when my kids were younger then, literally the only time where my job was cool over the last 27 years in payments was when I clicked that Nokia phone and the cashier, the person working there was like, "What did you just do? How did you pay that?" Like, assuming it was fraud of some sort. and now if you pay with anything but a watch or a phone, they kind of look at you like you're a dinosaur or something. So we have evolved a fair bit. The main, I think, key points on here, Google introducing their wallet back in 2011. Of course, the one that I remember most is 2014, Apple introduced Apple Pay. I was at the other payment brand, MasterCard, at the time, and the World Series had just launched. This is like literally the most fun 10 days of my life. I got to go to all 7 World Series games because Kansas City and San Francisco both had contactless acceptance. And so we were trying to launch Apple Pay. I was buying hot dogs for people and stuff, but we got to watch every single World Series game in 2014. I think the Giants took it in 7 back home. Good times.
Fantastic.
Within a year or so, Samsung and Android Pay launched, and then I think very near and dear to this conversation is Apple introduced Tap to Pay, and sorry, I should have said as well, Samsung and Android Pay became available in 2015 with ability to accept contactless. And yeah, let's go to the next slide. I think I'm going to talk more on the particulars here. I've already touched a fair bit on this. For most of my adult life, the payment was very much an EMVCo, Verifone, Equinox, PAX, what have you, device sitting on a merchant counter, and you come along and, for a number of years it was swipe, very non-secure, now insert, tap. But it was a fit-for-purpose device, and we had to ensure interoperability, security, and a great user experience. Then there's that kind of middle frame there, which I refer to as the dongle era. There's dongles for lots of things, whether it's plugging into your laptops and things, but mobile phone makers, I don't even know if they have those jacks anymore where you could put the little reader in.
Kind of headphone jacks.
Exactly.
They
yeah,
do exist on some phone. I've got a headphone jack on my phone.
Yeah, how old is that thing?
It's old.
Okay. Sorry. Anyway, my Apple product, I think Apple just announced they're going USB-C on their phones.
Yep.
The European regulators made them. But notwithstanding, there's not a lot of phones, save for yours, that have that jack anymore. But they could, in fact, do a swipe, do contact, and do contactless. And some of you may have been in taxis in the past where they've got like that big setup where it's actually got the screen and the payment terminal, and you go to pay on that payment terminal. They're like, no, wait, time out. I get a better rate if and they plug in their phone and they do it that way. So it's like, I feel badly for the taxi organization that actually put out those very expensive devices, but taxi driver is going to do what taxi driver is going to do what that's best for them. Fast forward a little bit, you kind of take that dongle and insert it into the phone, except there's no mag stripe and there's no contact acceptance. This is purely contactless. Of course, with an NFC reader in the phone, I think just a matter of time. You can use that device for making payments. If you've got the NFC receiver there, why not receive payments as well? But you've got to get all the security and things like that figured out, which is what we jointly try to work on.
Yeah, and I think an important concept to get across here as you look at these is we're moving from dedicated payment terminals to devices that aren't designed as payment terminals but can be used for payment terminals. And so the functionality and the operation of those has changed over time and is looked at differently. The NFC subsystems on a phone are not exactly the same as the contactless subsystems on a payment device, and I think that's what we'll be talking about in a minute.
And so the rise of mobile acceptance, and it's kind of, I apologize if I tell too many stories, but being old gives you two things. I have a terrible short-term memory and a better long-term memory. And so I remember those days when you go to like those festivals where people would be selling stuff and it was almost exclusively cash, but if it was a higher end product, they may in fact have an embossing machine or a knuckle buster or a zip zap or whatever you want to call it. And then if it was a big enough transaction, they'd phone in the auth and things like that. Whereas now virtually everybody has a smartphone. And if you are in that specific space where you're trying to sell goods, whether it's on a weekend or a plumber or whomever, you can now easily accept payments. And I know from my own personal, and I think a lot of other people are like this, I'm probably off the deep end because I've been so long in payments, I tend not to carry cash. So if I go to one of those things and there's a bar of soap for sale and I happen to need a bar of soap, or my wife more accurately thinks I need a bar of soap, it's like, okay, I can buy this now, but it's craft gourmet soap that's $20 a bar. I wouldn't otherwise buy it, but because I've got a payment device on me, I will. I think a lot of things happened, through the pandemic. It's a more hygienic way of paying, so that really accelerated.
That due to the soap?
That all ties back to this. You want me to step a little further away from you? Is that the growth of acceptance on mobile it typically is being hindered by the lack of a consistent experience. And mobile-to-mobile payments open up a world of commerce that independent vendors, and I've already talked about those, convenience retailers such as fast food outlets and stuff, and sometimes you'll see a mix where it's traditional point-of-sale terminal, but they'll also use line busters, with a tablet or something where they just come in, it's a long lineup, just start paying right then and there if you have electronic payments mean. And transit operators, as we're seeing around the world, including MTA and other jurisdictions in the US and frankly globally, like TfL in London, are accepting payments and accepting open loop payment device cards on their devices.
Yep, and it works really well. So just to kind of summarize what we've said over the last 20 minutes or so, is that with EMVCo and PCI SSC, we're focused on the same goal, on the same end, which is helping to secure payments, but doing it from different angles. And so when you think about a mobile payment solution, for example, something that works on a phone to accept payments, then from the PCI side, we're involved with how the applications and the SDKs work on that phone from a security point of view, how the back-end processing environments, whether they be for online PINs or payment processing work, how the attestation and monitoring systems work, and I'll probably talk about that a little bit later on. So the software, the hardware to some extent in terms of exactly how it's being secured on the device, if they're using, for example, a hardware key store, all of that's within the PCI realm. And then from an EMVCo point of view?
Yeah, it's again, the communication between the commercial off-the-shelf device and the payment instrument, make sure they're performing to the EMV protocol. So it sounds straightforward. You'd be surprised at how many iterations some have to go through to make sure that they're getting that right. And Tap to Mobile validates contactless reading ability of the COTS device.
Yeah, and so one thing we really wanted to clarify in this presentation is we have these different standards. From a PCI point of view, we have PCI MPOC. Tap to Mobile from an EMVCo point of view, they kind of sound like they're the same thing, like they're trying to do the same thing, but MPOC is the security aspect of the payment acceptance, and Tap to Mobile is the operational aspects of the mobile payment acceptance. So that is moving us on to exactly what is Tap to Mobile.
Yeah, so in August 2021, so a couple of years ago now, midst of the pandemic probably, we published some user experience guidelines around areas such as where do I tap, point to tap maybe on the reverse side of the screen. There is no fallback to swiping or inserting a card. And then in April 2022, we launched our commercial off-the-shelf early adopter program. We wanted to get some learnings, instead of just coming out with something and then realizing that we may have missed the mark, so we did an early adopter program. One of the major findings is that user experience on these devices depends mainly on the NFC strength or read range, which I think Andrew and I had a little chuckle when the Stripe guys, Sean and Rashawn, were trying to tap card on phones. Like maybe they need to be a little closer, maybe that read range, or there's a number of things. The card could actually be a metal card, which means it's got a little bit of a different way of conducting contactless transactions, et cetera, et cetera. There's all sorts of things that can impact what goes on with a contactless transaction in terms of the radio frequency and interference and where the antenna is related to where other antennas are, because mobile phones have Bluetooth antennas, cell phone antennas, Wi-Fi antennas, NFC antennas, et cetera, et cetera.
And so, contactless charging as well.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's the point that was made as well. It can depend not only on the phone, but on the card as well, because some cards have antennas in a certain spot. Some cards are metal cards and all fancy, but you know what? The metal kind of gets in the way of the contactless process that goes on. And all of this can make the process of accepting a card on a phone not quite as seamless as it is on a terminal. And so Tap to Mobile.
Actually, I had one of those flying in a couple of days ago. I was just trying to buy a charcuterie board on Air Canada, and they tapped my metal card face backwards onto the bottom of the reader. She's like, it doesn't work. I said, try flipping the card upside down. Now, this is if I take away one thing that I learned in Infineon over 7 years, because going in as a absolute neophyte in the semiconductor industry, I would have thought metal card would have a read range of like 10 feet or something, right? Because you got one massive metal antenna. It's quite the opposite. If anybody's gone whitewater rafting, it's an eddy current. It actually pushes the RF frequency back to the card. So what some of the metal card manufacturers have done, it had to put a ferrite layer that blocks that eddy current from happening. But that means you can only tap the card on one side. So we're here talking about, acceptance devices, but to Andrew's point, there's a whole lot of things that can differ in the card or mobile form factor that's being used to payment as well.
So what's next for EMVCo Tap to Mobile?
What's next? Out of a lot of that, read range information and data that we accumulated through the early adopter program, is we want to put some structure around it. So the normal, point of sale that resides on a merchant space, it typically has a read range of a couple inches or 5 centimeters. And I'm trying to think of how big that is, but it's as a consumer, as you get close, you hear the beep, it's the transactions happen, you can remove your card. On a commercial off-the-shelf device, we found a fairly wide range, and what we're trying to do is put some specificity around that. And the thinking at this point is we're going to put out LOAs that indicate, yes, this passed approval, but it's a reduced range, and likely a reduced range 1 centimeter or a reduced range 2 centimeter. And the goal is to let them know that, listen, 1 or 2, just because you got that doesn't mean you should stop trying. In fact, we will probably move those goalposts in the future because we don't think 1 is quite good enough if people are used to 5. So at least they know that, hey, if I can get from 1 to 2, then that's good. And if we can get everybody to 2, then we'll no longer do a reduced range 1 centimeter. And even better, if we can get the 2 closer to 5, then everything sort of looks and feels and has a user experience that's quite consistent. So that's what we're hoping to do. And as the final bullet point there indicates, the goal is not to keep that 1 centimeter read range, even though, and I will readily admit, quite often the tap is just that, where you take your card and you slap it on the screen of that acceptance device and you hope it works. But quite often, even as a payments dude, I should know better, but it's not always intuitive where you should be tapping. And that's where that 5 centimeter comes along. It could be higher up on sometimes it's on the back, which is really confusing to a Canadian because we have to enter a PIN for most, not contactless transactions, but contact transactions. So they actually have the PIN pad facing us, but the contactless reader facing away at merchant locations. And if you're paying by watch, which I like to do, then you're doing like the weird, I don't know what that move is, but yeah, yeah,
very cool.
It's Andrew Jamieson dance moves, which you will see later tonight.
Yes, just after a couple of beers.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I think the important thing to get across here is that we're moving from an environment where EMVCo has done a great job of specifying and having tested the contactless range of terminals. And they have worked brilliantly, and we're all very used to, I think by now, tapping a card, bringing it into that read range. You don't actually, once again, you can hold it like an inch off the terminal in the right spot and it will absolutely work. You don't have to literally tap the card, and that works seamlessly, works really well. But in the mobile acceptance space, these devices aren't designed for accepting payments. And so they don't have necessarily that same contactless read range. And so EMVCo now with Tap to Mobile is looking at, okay, how do we help the industry understand how to move forward with making these better for payment acceptance? So that's the Tap to Mobile side. And that brings us on to MPOC. So we've talked about Tap to Mobile. What exactly is MPOC? So MPOC is the security side of mobile payments then, in terms of how you can create an application, how you can create an SDK, how you can create a solution that can be used for payments acceptance. Now, there's some requirements that we have in MPOC. It must support some form of COTS native account data entry. Now, that sounds a little bit complex. What that means is this standard is not written for something that if you saw Sean's presentation, Stripe's presentation earlier on, we had that graphic from a PCI document that was released, I think it was 2012, which had the terminals accepting the payment and then being channeled through the mobile phone. That is not what this is intended for. The mobile phone is being used just as a modem, essentially. That's not the intent. The intent here is account data is actually being entered in some way into the mobile device. And importantly, it must support at least some form of EMV payment acceptance as well, because that's where the security in payments comes from the payment instrument side of things. So no PIN entry only, no MSR only, no use of external devices with no account data entry input on the COTS device. These no's, they apply per solution, per application. You can have a transaction that doesn't have account data entry on the COTS device. You can have a transaction that takes only information on an external device. That's fine, but for a whole solution, it has to support EMV. It has to support some sort of account data entry on the COTS device. And so we're talking about COTS device. What are they? And you brought this up earlier on. The definition is is, something people ask about all the time, and I completely accept that. So some positive and negative examples here in terms of, it can be absolutely a mobile device running Android or iOS. And I think that's commonly what we're going to see. You know what? In the standard, it doesn't use Android and iOS at all, because we're not here to specify exactly the implementation. We're here to specify the objectives. And so it might be some other operating system, as long as it meets the requirements. We do have requirements for the operating system within the MPOC standard. So it could be a mobile tablet or mobile phone that is not running Android or iOS, but is running something else as well, as long as it meets the security requirements and can be validated by a lab. It could be a non-consumer or commercial device if it meets other criteria. That a criteria does include it can't be designed for payments. MPOC is not designed as an alternative path for payment terminals. It is designed as a path for people who want to create a payment application solution to run on devices that are not designed for payments. So if you're doing something for payments, we've got a standard for that. That's PCI, PTS, POI. You can use things that don't use Google Play Store services as well. That's fine. COTS examples, negative examples, not a board computer. We're looking at consumer devices, things people buy and they use, mobile phones, tablets, those sorts of things. So not a Raspberry Pi, for example, BeagleBoard. Not devices which integrate the contact reader or an MSR reader into the form factor, because you know what, that's designed for payments at that point. Things that use an external NFC antenna, we're talking about devices here, and so it can't have like a USB antenna or something like that, because there's security implications around that, and not a multi-part device as well. So I want to look a little bit briefly around how an MPOC solution kind of goes together. And there's kind of two ways you can do it, with three possibilities. Those two ways are you can create a monolithic solution, or you can create a composite solution. So in a monolithic solution, as an organization, you create everything yourself. You do the back end, you create the attestation and monitoring service, which is something that looks at the environment, the operating system, the application in which that MPOC application is running, and make sure it's secure. You do all of that, you list your solution, and you have MPOC applications listed as part of that solution as well. That's fine, that can be done. But you can also have a composite solution. So one of the things we've done with MPOC is make something that is a little bit more modular. And so you can have something that relies on a listed MPOC software product. That software product could have an SDK, will generally have an SDK. It could have an application listed with it as well. But in order to create a payment solution, you need to take that SDK and integrate it into an application, or potentially the application that's listed as part of the software solution, software product, and then integrate that into a whole solution. Because that solution side of things is really important, because that looks at the key management, it looks at the back-end processing environments and so forth that are beyond just a software product point of view. We also allow for the listing of attestation and monitoring services, which take an MPOC software product and then implement this attestation and monitoring service, this service that looks at the security of the payment device, the environment, and within that COTS device, make sure it's secure. And then you can have solutions that then rely on that MPOC software and that attestation and monitoring service. So you can do all of those things. Now you can deploy in different scenarios as well with MPOC, but the most important thing to bear in mind is there are a couple of things that have to happen. You have to have the applications listed as part of the MPOC solution. You can have the SDKs within the software, the MPOC software, no problem, but you can't deploy those and accept payments directly. You need to integrate those into an application. That application then needs to be validated by a lab and put on the listing. You can't just integrate the SDK into an application and then use it for payments acceptance, not in an MPOC compliant way. You can have external acquirers, yes, but there are requirements around key management. There are requirements around merchant relationships that exist within the MPOC standard as well. So if you're going to do that, there are some complexities there that need to be accommodated for. And then one thing I wanted to get onto is the MPOC listing cycle. We have a 3-year listing cycle. So if you have an MPOC solution, you're listing an MPOC solution, you've gone through lab validation, that's great. You have an annual checkpoint that you have to go through. I'll talk a little bit about that annual checkpoint later on. Needs to be validated by the lab. If you're late in submitting that annual checkpoint, that's okay. We give 90-day grace period, but your listing will be indicated as late, essentially, in its annual checkpoint. After that 90 days, there is a secondary indicator to say, you know what, you're now over 90 days late. You really should get around to doing your annual checkpoint. And if it goes to 180 days late, then it is then expired and noted as expired on the list, moved to an expired list as well, potentially. So the thing to get to here, really important for those of you who are potentially MPOC vendors, is that if you submit something that is not within the annual checkpoint period, it's at 180 days late, and you go, what, we only missed it by a day or two. You didn't miss it by a day or two, you missed it by 180 days plus a day or two. We already accommodate for that delay, so please do get things on time, otherwise you will end up going to expired list. There's some foundations on which MPOC is built, and these are really important, one of them being EMV transactions, and the fact that EMV transactions are more secure than magnetic stripe transactions because of all the great work that our EMVCo colleagues have done in specifying how those cards work, how the transaction processing works with the terminal and the card. We also have within the MPOC kind of foundations, the assumptions, the standards built on, the vendor does not control the COTS platform because the vendors don't control what the Google and iOS is doing on their operating systems. And so there's security assumptions that go into that as well. Security does change over time, and that's really important. There's an assumption here that a platform onto which you deploy an MPOC application might be secure today, might meet all the requirements, but you know what? Sometime down the track, there's going to be vulnerabilities, there's going to be a lack of patching, there's going to be things that go on that make that platform no longer acceptable. So there's an assumption that within the standard, merchants are required to be communicated to and told that, you know what, you might need to migrate off older platforms. There's also requirements around vulnerability management and detection and so forth, and that leads into the annual checkpoint. Now, I'm not going to read this very full text, I'm not going to read through it. The important thing is this is taken from the MPOC program guide. We have requirements in this program guide around what you have to do for the annual checkpoint. There is assumptions that you are actually maintaining the system. Once again, if you're an MPOC vendor, I very much encourage you to make sure that you are maintaining your systems. Otherwise, when you get to the annual checkpoint, you're probably not going to pass through that and you will go onto the expired list. We do have an FAQ on this. So last year, I seem to have a habit of showing last year's slides, but last year I presented this slide that talked about where we were at that point in time, 2002, in terms of the MPOC release cycle. And this is where we are now. So we have the standard out, we have the program guide out, we have the AOVs out, the attestation of validations that exist as well. We have technical FAQs that come out at a regular cadence. So if you're looking to do something around this, please make sure you have a look at all of those documents. That brings us on to the summary here that EMVCo and PCI SSC are working together. So this is not Oliver in this photo, but this is Arman, who is your counterpart in Europe.
Right, Director of Technology.
Director of Technology in Europe. And this is myself and Arman doing some mobile payments things back in 2015. So before I was working for the council, before Arman was working with PCI SSC, we've been in this industry for a while, as have you.
Yeah, a couple of years.
And so the security of mobile acceptance requires operational correctness as well as secure implementation. When we designed the MPOC standard, it was designed based on the assumption that EMV provides a secure transaction processing environment, which it does. And from an EMV point of view, the tap to mobile focuses on operational aspects and so forth.
Yep.
MPOC focuses on security aspects. We're working together. And if you think about very quickly the mobile devices that you have that you use to make payments, has anybody really got rid of their cards? You still have plastic cards, but you know what? You have your phone as well, and you make payments with your phone and so forth. The cards still exist. In the same way, we foresee that terminals will exist alongside mobile payments as well, because they work differently, because you've got different contactless read ranges, because they provide a different benefit to the mobile phones as well. And so what we're doing from a PCI SSC, from an EMVCo point of view, is providing the stakeholders, the payment industry, with options on which they can deploy their payment solutions for their environments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.